Hey y'all, howdy, welcome to One for the Books. I'm Sandy Broadwell, and today we're gonna talk about some of the best books that I've read in a very long time. And I'm just so excited because I haven't done a monthly wrap-up since my September monthly wrap-up in early October. So I have quite a few books to talk to you guys about today. I'm not going to mention any of the books that I had in vlogs because I've already talked about those pretty extensively on my channel. And so these are just the books that haven't popped up in other sort of wrap-up or vlog videos. So I have 9 books to talk to you about today. And those are going to be the Age of Madness Trilogy by Joe Abercrombie. And then I'm going to do a definitive ranking of all 9 books in the First Law world. I'm going to talk about The Lotus Empire by Tasha Suri, which is the final book of the Burning Kingdoms trilogy. I'm going to talk about Wind and Truth by Brandon Sanderson and what I liked and didn't like about the book. And then the Winternight Trilogy by Catherine Arden and Livesuit by James S.A. Corey. So that's the rundown for the video. Let's get into it. So starting with the Age of Madness, this is, as I mentioned, the final trilogy of the First Law world. There's 9 books total in this world. It starts with the First Law trilogy, then there's 3 standalone books, and then the final Age of Madness trilogy, which is what I've read over the last few months. It starts with A Little Hatred, and I loved this series. I loved the Age of Madness so much as a part of the First Law world. I think it was pretty near pinnacle grimdark fantasy. If you've read any First Law books, you'll recognize this trilogy at least is focused on children of characters from the first series and standalone books. So the main 4 characters that we follow in this Age of Madness trilogy is Leo Dan Brock, who is the son of Fenry Dan Brock, and he is just old enough to really want to be pushing up against his parents. His mother, Fenry, is a very decorated general, very well respected, and Leo just wants to prove himself as a soldier and prove that he can take on commands for himself. So he's a bit hot-headed and spoiled. Ricky is the next main character. She is the daughter of the Dog Man, just one of the best Northman characters, period. But Ricky has a gift or a curse, depending on how you look at it, called the Long Eye, which allows her to see into the future. But it's a power that she can't control and often takes control of her. And so in this first book, she is really struggling with, discovering this power and figuring out how to live with it. Then the next main character is Savine Dan Glotka. She is the daughter of San Dan Glotka, and she is just a spoiled, rich socialite. She's a very effective businesswoman, and she's very cutthroat, and she will do whatever she needs to do to claw her way to the top of the business ladder. And that means that her businesses are very unethical and take advantage of their workers. But she doesn't care about those people, so it's fine. And then the final main character is Orso, who is the son of King Jazal. And Orso has really not had any demands placed on him his entire life. He has sort of wasted away most of his youth and is starting to come to the realization that that's not a very satisfying way to live. And he really does want to be able to have some accomplishments under his belt so that his people will respect him by the time he becomes king. But he's not really sure how to do that, and at every turn, things that he tries just don't go the way that he expects or wants them to. So those characters are set against the backdrop of what is essentially the Industrial Revolution in this world. And as you know from our world's Industrial Revolution, this was a very challenging time for people who were not wealthy. The people who are working in factories are treated very poorly. They are at risk. They have a lot of injuries. They're paid very poorly. They're breathing in all of this smog all the time and getting sick a lot because of the invention of a lot of machines that do their work more efficiently. A lot of them are laid off. There's rampant unemployment. and there's like child labor and all kinds of terrible things happening. In pairing with the rise of this industrial revolution is the rise of revolution of the underclass. And there's these groups of people that call themselves the breakers and the burners, who want to tear it all down and remake society with the low man on top, and how those forces play up against the four characters and the politics and how they navigate these sorts of scenarios is the basis of this entire trilogy. And the breakers and the burners do kind of catch up with some of our characters in this book, and those characters have to deal with the horror and the trauma of seeing people slaughtered in the streets and taken prisoner and all sorts of things. So it's a wild ride. The Trouble with Peace is the second book, and in this trilogy, same with the First Law World trilogy, I felt like every book just got better. So The Trouble with Peace is basically like full-on revolution is happening, and there are sides that are chosen, and some of our main characters that I mentioned in book one are actually on opposing forces of a big battle that takes place in The Trouble with Peace. And then finally, The Wisdom of Crowds is kind of the fallout of all of that, and some characters are put on trial, which was super fascinating, one of my favorite parts of the book. And there's also a battle for dominance of the North, which has been taking place kind of in conjunction with and to the side of all of the mess that's happening in the main kingdom. Ricky is obviously involved with the battle for the North, and the way that the twists happened with that battle and the way that Joe Abercrombie kind of hid from the readers what her actual plans were definitely led you to believe that some things were going to happen that didn't happen. I just thought was super masterful and definitely was one of the highlights of the series overall for me. So I just absolutely loved these characters, even though they are completely despicable at times and definitely like not what you would think of as likable characters. They were so real. Their motivations were so real. Joe Abercrombie, even though it's grimdark and everything is dark and nothing turns out kind of the way that you hope, there's just so much humor laced into the writing, and it's a combination of like deep social commentary and like black humor that just really scratches a particular itch in my brain, and no one does it better than Joe Abercrombie. So if I was to rank, for me personally, what were the best books of the entire First Law world, all 9 of them, number 1 would actually be number 5, The Heroes, which was a standalone book that I won't go into details on because I've talked about it extensively in other videos, but if you want to see my top 10 books of 2025, this one was really high up on that list, so I'll link that video down below. But number 1 would be The Heroes. Number 2 would be The Wisdom of Crowds, which is the 9th book. And then that trilogy, just 1, 2, 3, would be The Wisdom of Crowds, The Trouble with Peace, and The Age of Madness. And then my 5th favorite book would be Best Served Cold, which was the 4th book, a standalone book after the first trilogy. That was like a really fun kind of revenge tale where there was like X number of people betrayed this woman and she hunts them down one at a time. It was great. And then, so 6 through 8 would be the first trilogy for me, also in reverse order because I thought each of those books got better over time. So The Last Argument of Kings would be 6, Before They Are Hanged would be 7, and The Blade itself would be 8. And then my least favorite book of the series was actually the 6th book, the final standalone book, which was Red Country. I was just really disappointed by that one for reasons that I also talk about in my worst books of 2024. So if you want to see my thoughts on that, you can click on that video below. But that's how I personally would rank the First Law world. If you have read all of these books, I would love to know how your ranking would stack up compared to mine, and if our favorites and least favorites mesh or clash. So let me know down in the comments below. Next up, I'm going to talk about The Lotus Empire by Tasha Suri. This is the 3rd and final book of the Burning Kingdoms, which starts with the Jasmine Throne. I really loved this series. The world building was super unique and cool. There is so much great emotional angst between the characters. There's really strong characters. There's betrayals. It's fantastic. The third book was not as good for me as the second book. I think the second book was the peak of this story for sure. But I do love that the third book kind of plays with what happens if the gods that you have devoted your life to and worshipped return and they're not who you thought they were. That's kind of where the third book goes. I do wish that Bhumika, one of the main three characters from the first two books, had played a larger role in this one. I felt like she was sidelined just a little bit, which was a little bit of a disappointment for me. But overall, I found this to be a very satisfying ending for this series. I thought it was really well done, and I definitely highly recommend picking up the Burning Kingdoms trilogy. Okay, so now let's talk about Wind and Truth. I know that might be why some of you clicked on this video. I have heard a lot of really mixed things about Wind and Truth, and I feel like my perspective on this is quite a bit different, I think, from a lot of people that I've heard, particularly because I read all of these books, all of the Stormlight Archive, for the very first time in 2024. So this was all fresh for me. Like, I started The Way of Kings in March, and then I pretty much read one Stormlight Archive book every other month for all of 2024. So I didn't have like the built up tension that a lot of fans did. I didn't have all of these crazy fan theories that everyone else did. So I guess I had like less hype and an expectation built in going into this, because I haven't been waiting 4 years for this final conclusion to the Stormlight Archive. And so that, I think, made my overall reading experience different, not better or worse necessarily. But I really liked Wind and Truth. I'll just get that out of the way. I gave it 5 stars, because even though this was not by far the best book in the Stormlight Archive, or even the second best book in the Stormlight Archive, I still think I would rather most of the time be reading a Stormlight Archive book than most other fantasy books that I pick up. The series is just that good. Even though I'm like, oh, it wasn't as good as I hoped, it's still so much better than so many other stories that I pick up throughout the year. So it just feels like it's wrong to not give it 5 stars, you know what I mean? So I'm going to start by talking about the things I loved, and then I will end with things that I didn't love about Wind and Truth. And I'm not going to talk about spoilers, but I will talk about them with specific vagaries enough that if you have already read Wind and Truth, you should know what I'm talking about. So the first thing that I really loved about Wind and Truth was Odium's champion. This was a big question at the end of Rhythm of War of who Odium's champion was going to be when they have this contest of champions that we know was going to take place. And I thought who was selected for that was shocking and tragic and just utterly devastating, and I felt that like a gut punch. I guess I will say this was also one of the things that I didn't like about the book, was that I wish we had sat in those feelings a little bit more and leaned into them a little bit harder. As long as this book was, that was one thing that I thought we could have spent more time thinking about or talking about, was the impact of Odium's champion on the characters around that person. Another thing that I really loved about Wind and Truth was the countdown aspect of it. As you know, at the end of Rhythm of War, we have 10 days until the contest of champions, and the stakes are raised significantly in what happens over those 10 days because of a loophole in the contract that Odium found. So that really makes all of the things that are happening outside of the contest of champions feel really important. And I loved the way that kind of elevated the panic that you feel as the days are counting down. I loved the greater look that this book gave us at the Cosmere. I have not, again, I just read these books for the first time. I've read all of the Mistborn books, but I haven't really delved any deeper into the Cosmere, and so I'm sure there's things I missed out on, but I did love kind of the opening up of the world. For those of you who don't know, all of Brandon Sanderson's books essentially are part of this Cosmere like universe, and the Stormlight Archive really, Wind and Truth really cracks open like the interconnections of all of those things, and I really thought that was fascinating. The fourth thing I really loved about Wind and Truth was a romantic relationship that blossoms between two prominent male characters. I thought that was really sweet and well done, and I thought that the sort of factions that those men represent and the kind of symbology, I guess, of what their relationship could mean for the future was just really cool, and I'm excited to see how that might play out in the future of the Stormlight Archive. And then the fifth thing that really I just absolutely loved about Wind and Truth was Adelin's timeline, or Adelin's storyline, I guess, in this book, because Adelin is a character that has been a famous soldier. He's really talented and well known as a soldier, but he is one of the few characters in the Stormlight Archive that doesn't have powers, and that becomes more and more true as the series goes on and more characters gain powers, but Adelin doesn't, and so he has to find a way to still remain relevant to his friends who he used to be able to protect but now are so much more powerful than he is, and kind of the psychological impact that has on him and how he deals with it. And in this book, Adelin really takes on more of the role of a general and has to kind of step back from that frontline soldier that he's always been, and I feel like the growth that takes place for this character in this story was so well done and some of my favorite parts of the book to read. So those are the main like 5 things that really stood out to me about Wind and Truth. Things I didn't love as much, I already mentioned the whole like the impact of Odium's champion, like we should have spent more time there, which in a 1,300 page book you would think we have plenty of time for these things, but we didn't. I will say I thought the pacing in some parts felt a little slow, and I don't think that should have been the case because of like the timeline, and everything kind of could have been a little bit tighter in some areas. And I think part of the reason the pacing felt slow is because the stakes didn't feel as high for some characters. For instance, Kaladin and Zeth, they are off doing a quest that doesn't feel as relevant to the main storyline. And you find out at the end of the book that it is, and it actually has a huge impact on everything else and everything carrying forward. But for most of the book, you don't really realize how those things are interacting. And so it just feels like the quest that Kaladin and Seth are on is a bit of a side quest. And it's like, well, why are we over here doing this when we should be over here doing these things? And so it made sense in the end, but I don't feel like the stakes felt relevant for the majority of the book. And so there was just a few things like that made the pacing feel a little bit slow sometimes. And then the ending, even though in some ways I absolutely loved the ending and it was like so epic and so good, I really don't like that every character seemingly is in a bit of a limbo state at the end of the Stormlight Archive. So for those of you who don't know, the Stormlight Archive, Brandon Sanderson had planned 5 books in this first era, and then there's going to be a second era of 5 more books. But Brandon Sanderson has said it's going to be like 8 or 10 years before he gets around to writing the next Stormlight Archive books, because he's like taking a break to work on other projects, which like good for him. But the fact that all of our characters that we love are in various states of unfinished business or peril or limbo or whatever is just really unsatisfying in some ways. Like characters who love each other are separated, or characters who are like grievously injured haven't been healed yet, or you know, there's just like, I just wish there was a bit more. I expected a bit more finality, I guess, for the end of an era. And instead, even though I expected like the main big Cosmere storyline to be unfinished, I expected kind of all of the surrounding storylines to be in kind of a good ending point. And I don't really feel like that's what we got. I don't think that's bad necessarily. as long as it wraps up well in the future, but considering it might be like a decade before we find out what the fate of those characters is going to be, like it's just a little bit unsatisfying, I guess. So I understand why some people didn't enjoy this. I have heard quite a few people say that they didn't appreciate like the sense of humor in this book, that was like incongruous for them. That didn't bother me. I felt like it was pretty on par with other Brandon Sanderson things that I've read, and I didn't feel like it deviated too much from the other Stormlight books. But again, that's just me. So that's my thoughts on Wind and Truth. I loved it. I still had problems with it, but overall it was a fantastic read, and I'm so happy that I got to pick up the Stormlight Archive in 2024 and be a part of the hype train for Wind and Truth. Then I read the Winternight Trilogy by Catherine Arden, and this is the series that starts with The Bear and the Nightingale. This is a perfect wintertime read. It's set in medieval Russia, out in the deep winter country, and the vibes are just immaculate. I will say the pacing in this first book is a bit slow. It's very like kind of traditional fantasy setup of like storytelling and gathering around the fire and just like slowly building this world. The second half of the book definitely picks up. But the main character in the Winternight Trilogy is a girl named Vazia. She lives with her siblings on her father's estate, and it's about what happens as she grows up. Vazia is accused of being a witch at a time when Christianity is on the rise in Russia, and a new priest moves to their village and wants to stamp out all of the kind of traditional pagan beliefs that the people hold about like leaving out offerings for their household spirits and things like that. So he comes and is very fire and brimstone, and he strikes fear into the heart of these villagers, and they all stop worshiping these traditional like Russian folklore household spirits and wood spirits and barn spirits and things like that. And because of that, the crops start to fail, evil creeps closer in the woods, and Vazia is the only person who can see these creatures and spirits and speak to them, which is why they call her a witch. But she has to figure out a way to stop this rising evil with the help of the household spirits and the demon of winter. So it was a really delightful story, and I feel like it holds up well as a standalone book. I love that there's a trilogy, but if you just want to read one book, it has a satisfying conclusion. The second book is called The Girl in the Tower, and this one is about, at the end of book one, Vazia has to flee from her home for reasons I won't go into, and she disguises herself as a boy in order to survive better in this world and in this land. And that all gets turned on its head when she performs an act of heroism in front of the Grand Prince of Moscow, and he is so impressed by her, he wants to honor her and like bring her into his court of politics. And so she suddenly has to like maintain this facade while dealing with all of this kind of intrigue and court politics, and at the same time there is a rising evil in Moscow that she has to figure out how to defeat while not revealing her true identity. And then the third book of the Winternight Trilogy is The Winter of the Witch. And in this one, the fate of Moscow and the fate of the spirit world that she knows and loves so much are both at grave risk. And she has to figure out a way to bring these two unlikely allies together to fight against the greater evil that threatens them all. And I just absolutely love this series. I think Vazia is a super great character. I loved her so much, and I loved how much agency she had and the decisions that are made in these stories, and just the way that the story plays out couldn't have played out the same way if a different character was in her shoes. There was also great animal companions. The spirits and demons that she interacts with are super fascinating. I loved learning all about the Russian folklore that was tied up in these stories, and I just think that this will definitely be a series that I want to reread in the future. It was delightful. And finally, the very last story that I have to talk to you guys about today is Livesuit by James S.A. Corey. This is a novella set in the Captives War world, and the first book of the Captives War is The Mercy of Gods. However, this short story novella is not really related to the main story of the novels. It's set set like planets away. There's no interacting characters. There's no connections other than the same overarching war is happening. And so humanity is at war with an alien species called the Carricks. It's devastating. The humans are losing horribly, but it's actually really hard to know how badly or how well they're doing because of the nature of like space-time and travel and distance across space. So the frontline soldiers, the best soldiers in this war, are called the Livesuit soldiers. They're the like frontline infantrymen, and Livesuits are these suits that they put on that make them like super enhanced super soldiers. And if they get like really grievously injured, like right at the beginning, one of the soldiers' feet is like completely crushed, and the suit just like seals off his like the bottom half of his leg and like keeps it all together and healed up, and like injects him with all sorts of drugs and everything so that he can't feel it, and like compensates for the loss of his limb in the mechanism of the suit. And so when a Livesuit infantryman enlists, when they put on the suit, they do not take it off ever again until they finish their term of duty. So that's just fascinating. They never see each other's faces. They never get to like touch another person while they're enlisted, but it's because their suit is keeping them safe and together and all of that stuff. The main soldier that we follow in the story, it talks about like why he enlisted, and it does show like him communicating with his former lover like back on the planet, and he sees her age and grow old because he's out like hopping, you know, these huge distances, and so huge amount of time passes on the planet that he's from, but very little time passes for him and his enlistment and the battles that he fights. And so that's a really interesting dynamic. But the real kicker of this story, I feel like, doesn't come until the last 10 pages, when the soldier really starts to figure out what it means to be in a Livesuit. And it definitely has some like pretty intense horror vibes in the last few pages, and I ate it up. It was so good. I gave it 5 stars. I thought this was such a fascinating little snippet of a sci-fi story. I don't feel like you need to have read The Mercy of Gods to enjoy this or to understand anything. You just need to know humanity's at war with aliens. That's it. So those are the 9 books that I haven't really had a chance to talk to you guys about on the channel yet that I've read from October to now. So let me know down in the comments below if you've read any of these, if you want to read any of these because I pitched it to you really well, or what some of the best books that you've read over the winter have been so far. I'd love to hear about it down in the comments. Thanks so much for tuning in and hanging out. As always, please be kind, read more books, and hit the subscribe button down below for more bookish content to come. I'll see you again soon.